Welcome to PAR Podcast, episode 77.52. PAR Podcast is an audio supplement for Public Administration Review, the premier professional journal in the field of public administration. This year, 2017, inaugurates PAR's 77th year furthering public administration research, theory, and practice. This episode features comments by Michael Macaulay, who is the director of the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies at the Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. Professor Macaulay discusses his article titled, From Birth to Death, The Life of the Standards Board for England. Alan Lawton is a co-author on this article and is a professor of management in the Federation Business School at Federation University in Australia. This article is currently available on Early View and will be published in Public Administration Review, Issue 77, Volume 5.
Our paper uses an organisational life cycle model, which we appreciate has its detractors and its critics, but nonetheless we found very useful and very interesting for looking at the Standards Board for England, which was essentially an ethics regulator for local government in England and Wales, not Scotland and Northern Ireland, I'd like to point out. And we used the OLC model to look at the entirety of its birth, its life and its death, ranging from its establishment in 2001 under the Local Government Act 2000 until its abolition in 2012, which was under the Localism Act 2011. Eagle-eyed readers of Public Administration Review may note that Standards Board for England has appeared in these hallowed pages a number of times in the past, whether that's been through articles written by Alan and myself, or from our colleagues James Down, Richard Cowell and others over in the UK who have produced some fabulous research. I thoroughly recommend that you read that. And in fact, pound for pound, it is very possible that even though it's somewhat of a failed agency, the Standards Board for England is potentially the most written about UK government agency of the 21st century, I would suggest, up until this time. But I've got no real evidence for that, so you'll have to take my word for it. So, as I mentioned, the Standards Board for England was established in 2001. And what's really interesting in terms of the life cycle is that some of the seeds of its destruction may have been sown at its very birth. It emerged as a suite of reforms under Part 3 of the Local Government Act 2000, and it was the only part of those reforms that ever had any serious or substantial political opposition. In fact, it was also the only part of those reforms that was never recommended by the Committee on Standards in Public Life, who produced a report in 1997-98, which was absolutely influential in the creation of the legislation. So it always kind of started out on a bit of the back foot. And what we found, and we particularly used it, I should note here, we used Phelps et al.'s 2007 notion of problem clusters, looking at life cycles. We call these crises clusters instead. We noted that Standards Board for England had a number of successes. These successes were rarely ever publicised or spoken about, but they definitely had them, and we'll come back to that at the very end. But when you characterise the entire life cycle of the organisation, you see it in a number of different forms of crises. So the first that I've kind of just alluded to was the crisis of birth. The second was the crisis of identity. Now, as I mentioned, the Standards Board for England was originally set out as the ethics regulator, and its primary interest was in investigations and hearings, investigations of breaches of the Code of Conduct in a variety of different local councils up and down England and Wales. But that soon became apparent that it couldn't really fulfil that role, and furthermore that it maybe shouldn't be fulfilling that role, and that role should be taken care of at the local level rather than at the central level. And this came to pass in 2007, that those powers were devolved back down to local councils. And 2007 marked a bit of a sea change, really, in the Standards Board. It went from being primarily an investigatory body to very much a strategic regulator. And it even decamped from London up to Manchester to try and give it more of a kind of more of a connection, I think, to all of England and Wales, so it wasn't seen as so London-centric. But nonetheless, that shows that there was always a mark around its identity. The two other real crises that it had to address all the time was a crisis of confidence. It was frequently trying to justify its own existence, which is a shame, really, because, as I say, it was very successful in many respects. And finally, and probably most tellingly, there was a crisis of legitimacy in trying to justify itself all the time. there was always an indication that it was trying to react to things, that central government was very much in the driving seat, and essentially that it wasn't fulfilling the roles that could provide public value. Now, we could debate whether or not we feel that was a legitimate argument, but nonetheless that was definitely the political mood. And with the coming of the coalition government in 2010, as I say, the Localism Act 2011 came about, and it basically abolished the entire local government standards and integrity regime, of which the Standards Board was such a big part. So some of the interesting things that we found generally was that as a regulatory agency, it didn't really suffer from some of the things you might expect. It never suffered, for example, from regulatory capture. That was never an issue for the Standards Board whatsoever. And in fact, the problems it did have were a lot more general. A problem with entry requirements, for example. There was always a lack of clarity about what it was going to do and its actual remit that it was meant to follow. There was always the concern, as I mentioned, about reacting to events rather than being more proactive in its leadership. There was always a sense that the Standards Board was on the back foot. And probably to return to a previous comment, the cycle of justification became almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, this isn't something that we feel pertains only to regulatory agencies. We feel that these are fairly general comments and observations that could pertain to a number of other organisations in a number of other sectors. But it was very interesting, we find, that it was applicable in this way specifically to an ethics regulator, and potentially quite unusual in that way. Anyway, I hope that's an interesting précis of the work, and if anyone's still listening to this, thank you very much. I appreciate that, and I sincerely hope you have a look and that you find it valuable and enjoyable, and feel free to contact either Alan or myself anytime. Take care.
This concludes PAR Podcast, episode 77.52. To listen to additional episodes and learn more about Public Administration Review, please visit us online at publicadministrationreview.org. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at PA Review. Thanks for listening.